Welcome, everybody, and thanks for joining us today. Glad to see so many folks joining and participating in the conversation. So I wanted to start off by saying this is not a sales pitch for Axiom Cloud. Our goal is really to help highlight the cost of inaction when it comes to refrigerant leaks and to highlight the benefits of being really proactive to lower those HFC refrigerant leak rates now. And this is an opportunity for us all to have an industry conversation about this super relevant and urgent and timely topic. So if you only take away one thing from today's discussion, it should be this. Even if you're rapidly changing over to CO2 refrigeration, now is the time to prioritize lowering your HFC refrigerant leak rates. The financial, compliance, operational, and sustainability benefits are massive, and the cost of inaction is just too high to justify. So starting on a little background for me, I'm the CEO and co-founder of Axiom Cloud. I've been helping grocery chains and large commercial refrigerated facilities optimize their refrigeration for, I guess, like 12 years now. Refrigeration is a massive climate opportunity and financial opportunity. That's why I'm here. That's what really gets me excited. It's a massive, overlooked, and underserved category. We started Axiom Cloud a few years ago to solve the biggest problems plaguing this space using software and automation. And I'm more excited about our recently announced early leak detection module than any other new technology we've introduced in the refrigeration industry to date. Today, we have hundreds and hundreds of stores where this is already operating. And the early leak detection module has proven that we can basically increase Axiom's greenhouse gas impact by more than a factor of 10x, which is incredibly motivating to me and the Axiom team. And so I'm really excited to partner with the big grocery and cold storage companies to deploy this new leak detection technology in thousands of facilities really fast so that we can realize these climate and financial benefits at scale today. So with all that, now let's talk about our agenda for the day. So to begin with, we'll go through current state of refrigerant leaks in the industry, talk about why we should be focusing on lowering HFC leak rates today. And some of the key reasons obviously are operational, business continuity, cost, sustainability, regulatory compliance. And yes, we will address the elephant in the room, which is the election of Trump as president, and how that may or may not affect things. And then we're going to talk about how to convince leadership to make leak rate reductions a priority in 2025, because in many cases, there's so many competing priorities, and this is, one of 20 items to consider. And then we'll talk about what options are available to lower HFC leak rates today, and we'll go straight into Q&A. So I don't anticipate we'll take the entire time with slides. The goal here is to really facilitate a conversation and then maybe give a little bit of time back at the end too. So let's jump right in. Zooming out, this is an NASRC survey that was done earlier this year, I believe. And really what this is showing is, I believe there were, 14 food retailers who responded to this survey. And ultimately, these are the folks who were involved in NASRC. They're more proactive. They're already on the path of deploying CO2 refrigeration across their portfolios of facilities. And even among this somewhat proactive, probably industry-leading group, it looks like in the next 5 years, they're only going to be achieving about 22% penetration of CO2 throughout their facilities. And that makes a lot of sense because the life cycle of these refrigeration assets can be 25 or 30 years. It doesn't make sense to change out a whole bunch of brand new systems that were just installed in the last 5 years. So there's going to be this period where we're in the transition. And then, of course, there's the rest of the industry, where the other folks in the space are probably less excited about CO2 are going to take even longer. And so what do we do about the vast majority of facilities that still use HFCs over the next 20, 30, 40 years? Leaking HFCs at rates of 20% or more per year is simply not a viable option anymore for many of the reasons that we're going to jump into in the coming minutes here. So looking at where we are today as an industry, the price of refrigerant gas has skyrocketed in recent years. And this has been a function of a lot of things. Regulation has been a part of it, though. The EPA's AIM Act, which is curtailing the supply that's available to the industry. There was a major step down in supply on January 1st of 2024, and that caused ripples throughout the space. But a lot of folks have already begun banking refrigerant in anticipation of this, and they're putting in place reclamation programs to make sure that there's plenty of gas available for the coming years. Despite all these precautionary measures that the industry has been taking, the price of gas is still skyrocketing and doesn't show any signs of slowing down in terms of that trajectory of increasing over time. Another key number here is that the leak rate trigger for commercial refrigeration is 20% per year. And so basically, if you're leaking less than 20% per year, that's considered not bad, essentially. And at that point, you're no longer required to self-report to the EPA, and a lot of the record-keeping requirements also get a lot lower as well. So long story short, 20% a year is kind of considered typical or average in a lot of cases, or 25% a year is a number that the EPA has thrown around in prior years. That's not a good number from a climate, from a financial, from an operational, or from a overall business continuity standpoint. But that is kind of what the industry and the regulators have set as the appropriate trigger leak rate. But we're going to talk about why that's not necessarily the best target to be shooting for. And then the third and final important number here is that 50% of a store's Scope 1 emissions, and in many cases, over half of Scope 1 and 2 emissions, are driven by refrigerant leaks. And so there's a quote here at the bottom from Fritz, who's the CEO of Therm, kind of really hammering this home. This is a massive sustainability opportunity for us as an industry. This is how we can make a pretty significant dent in total human climate change emissions. It's just by simply reducing how much of these incredibly potent greenhouse gas refrigerants that we can in a really cost-effective way that has so many other benefits as well for our businesses. So I wanted to share this analogy to help show just how absurd the status quo is. Most leaks in grocery stores remain undetected for weeks or months while the gas slowly seeps out. And then one day, store personnel starts noticing temperature issues, and then the whole system goes down shortly thereafter, because nearly all the refrigerant has leaked out. So this method of waiting for temperature alarms essentially guarantees downtime, high leak rates, and red flags that may be noticed by regulation enforcement agents. It's just crazy. It's like driving down the highway in your car without a gas needle, and everything is totally fine until it isn't. And then it's a big hair on fire emergency, and your entire day is ruined. So that's where we are as an industry today. Fundamentally, lowering leak rates is not rocket science. Essentially, the whole ballgame here is, the status quo is you wait until the system has temperature issues and has almost completely run out of gas. So on this graph, you're over here at 0.7 in time. So these are not hours or days. These are just kind of arbitrary points in time. And a lot of times, leaks are not detected until you've reached 0.7 on this graph, which is when you start to have these temperature issues, and suddenly your business is your ability to sell groceries is compromised at that point. The whole name of the game here is let's detect leaks earlier on this graph. Let's detect them over at 0.2. It's as simple as that. Just let's detect them earlier, and then let's resolve them and fix them promptly. So that's it. Obviously, the devil's in the details of how that's achieved, but this is not a really crazy science problem in a lot of ways. So the next big question is, why should I be focusing on lowering my HFC leak rates today, among a myriad of other priorities that I also need to be considering? So these are the 4 key areas that we're going to talk through today. The first is business continuity. Ultimately, the whole point of being in the retail grocery business is to sell groceries. And when the refrigeration system in your facility is down and you have a cooling outage, that's really the nightmare scenario. That is disrupting all stakeholders. It's disrupting your ability to sell groceries and make your numbers as well. From a cost standpoint, ignoring all the business continuity impacts, just the cost of these leaks can push your store into the red for days, weeks, or even months in some cases, a single leak. From a sustainability standpoint, this is the whole ballgame. For a lot of folks, this is the primary driver of Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. And so by reducing this leak rate, you can have a massive impact on the entire grocery corporation's emissions profile. And then, of course, there's regulatory compliance from EPA, CARB, and many, many other state regulators at this point who are taking notice and paying attention to HFC leak rates. So we'll go through each one of these in a little bit more detail. Obviously, from a business continuity standpoint, a cooling outage is the nightmare scenario for a grocery store manager, the grocery store or the grocery company CEO, and in many cases also the shopper, the weekly shopper who's there buying groceries for his family or her family. And in many cases, a single day of lost sales can push the store into the red for the entire month and the entire quarter. So when there is a cooling outage, there's some really visible impacts. The maintenance truck shows up, the technician shows up, but there's a lot of invisible costs as well, or invisible impacts that affect every other part of the entire business model, down to things like food spoilage and shrinkage, employee satisfaction and turnover, and then customer loyalty and cart size. And so to put a finer point on that last piece here, an Ipsos survey showed that nearly 1 in 4 shoppers will go to a different grocery store next time if 1 to 3 items from their list are unavailable. So if you have a cooling outage and your freezer section is down for 4 hours, let's say, or your dairy box is out for 4 hours, whatever it might be, suddenly you have essentially alienated hundreds of shoppers, and a large percentage of those are not going to come back next week or the next time they need to shop. That's really significant. And that's really tough to quantify, but in many cases, that's the primary driver why folks are really caring about business continuity and leak reduction as a function of that. Pardon me. So the next topic we'll talk about is cost. According to FMI, the average grocery store in the United States has about $10,000 of profit per week. And this is just going straight off the FMI website. According to the EPA, the average grocery store is spending over $30,000 just for replacement refrigerant gas. And so that's assuming 875 pounds a year at about $35 a pound for 404A or a similar gas. Of course, these numbers may not be exactly right for your business, but just to give you a sense of kind of relative magnitudes here, these various numbers. So the bottom line here is that in this average case, supermarkets are spending 3 weeks of profit per year paying just for replacement gas. And that's ignoring all the additional costs of leaks from lost sales, technician time, trip charges, store employee time, and of course, also the business continuity impacts. So just from a cost standpoint, that's another reason why a lot of folks are prioritizing leak reduction in 2025. The third piece is sustainability. So for companies that really care about their sustainability metrics and who care about the planet, refrigerants are the most obvious place to begin. And HFC leak reduction is the most obvious place to begin. That's because these F gases represent 3 to 4% of all of humankind's climate emissions. That is more than the entire aviation industry. So every airplane in the sky throughout the course of an entire year, we as a retail grocery and refrigeration and air conditioning industry are creating more of an impact on climate change than every airplane in the sky for an entire year. Just to put this in perspective. Leaking 1 pound of HFC refrigerant has the same impact of emitting thousands of pounds of CO2. And in fact, leaking 2 to 4 pounds of refrigerant has the same impact as driving a car for an entire year. So, and obviously the average grocery store is leaking an enormous amount of gas every single year. So you multiply kind of the potency of these refrigerants times these really high leak rates, and that's a climate crisis all in itself. And solving these refrigerant emissions can avoid around 0.5 degree Celsius of global warming. And that's, I believe, on the order of about 1 degree Fahrenheit. It's about a 200 gigaton opportunity. And refrigerants have been ranked as the single largest solution to reverse global warming by Project Drawdown. So we have an enormous problem on our hands and also an enormous opportunity. And the folks in this room, the folks in this industry, we have the opportunity to, dramatically bend the curve on climate change because we're in positions where we can really effectively reduce how much of this gas is being leaked. And that's more powerful than driving your car less, than doing the other myriad number of different things that you could do. This is arguably the single most important action that any of us in this room could take, is helping to reduce HFC leak rates across our fleet of existing facilities today. The final piece we'll talk about here is regulatory compliance. And there's obviously the federal part of that puzzle, there's the state level part of that puzzle, and then there's the Donald Trump part of that puzzle. And we'll talk about all three. So from a federal standpoint, obviously the AIM Act, the American Innovation and Manufacturing Act, is the whole ballgame here. And this was signed into law by President Trump in 2020. And so this has been called the single most effective climate action ever taken in the United States because of just the outsized impact that it can have. Subsection H is one of the 3 elements of this regulation. It was implemented in 3 different sections. This is the 3rd element. And it's focused on minimizing leaks and maximizing reclamation of HFCs. Sorry, this cold is really getting me. And this final rule went into effect on September 20th of 2024. And the EPA has gone so far as listing HFC enforcement as a top 3 enforcement priority for 2024 through 2027. Within the text of the regulation itself and the associated documents, it does outline penalties of up to $57,000 per violation per day and potential for jail time. And this enforcement really kicks into gear on January 1st of 2026. So it might seem like far away, but we're talking just over 12 months away is when the entire portfolio of facilities needs to be in compliance. That's not a lot of time. From a state standpoint, Morgan, do you want to briefly touch on this one?
Trying to get my unmute there. Yeah, happy to touch on this. This is from our website. We've got an HFC policy tracker on the website for those who aren't aware. And really the key point here is that, the states have also taken action to address HFC emissions and to take regulatory actions. Most notably, New York, Washington, and California have all taken steps to go beyond what the EPA is doing at the federal level. Those states, of course, have, tremendous impacts on the economy. They're both, high, or all 3 of those have a high population. And so, just alone, those 3 states really have a heavy impact on the direction that the industry is taking and just continuing to increase regulatory pressures to transition out of HFC refrigerants.
Yeah, thanks, Morgan. I think one of the key takeaways that I had in doing this research and learning about this, especially in the last month or so, has been that so many of these states were already leaning into this HFC leak reduction priority in a big way prior to the AIM Act. But then the AIM Act came out and it seemed like the whole problem was solved in a lot of ways. And so these states took all this hard work they had done and they said, mission accomplished, and they put it in the drawer. And so now the question becomes, in case there are reasons that the federal government is not going to be enforcing the AIM Act, what's going to happen in these 20 plus states and others as well? And I think the really clear answer there is that folks are going to be pulling these kind of pre-packaged bills and regulatory processes out of the drawer and putting them back into action very quickly because they're already ready to go. So with that, actually, quick preview of the next slide here. If I can get to it. Do I need to worry about AIM Act compliance under President Trump? And so basically a couple of data points here. One is the AIM Act originally was co-sponsored by 34 senators, including 17 Republican senators. This was one of the most heavily bipartisan bills that we saw in that entire session. And then former President Trump actually signed this bill into law himself in 2020, directing the EPA to regulate HFCs. So obviously there's the Republican support, there's Trump's support himself, but beyond that, there's really broad industry support as well from a really interesting list of names here. There's key trade organizations such as the American Chamber of Commerce, ASHRAE, AHRI, et cetera. Then there's leading refrigerant gas suppliers, including Honeywell, Chemours, and Agas. These are the folks who are selling the really exotic refrigerants that are, in the process of being displaced by naturals right now. And they're behind the AIM Act, and they're lobbying for it and going on the record, testifying in front of Congress, saying that they're supportive of the AIM Act. And then there are leading refrigeration OEMs, including Danfoss, Daikin, Carrier, and Lennox International. Same exact thing. They're going on the record, testifying in front of Congress, submitting statements saying they're in support of AIM Act. A couple other really important pieces here. One is that the EPA can reach back 3 or more years according to the text of the AIM Act, and future administrations may choose to enforce this act. So put another way, if there is a future presidential administration that has a different set of policies than Trump, kind of ignoring what may or may not happen under the Trump administration in the future. If there is a future administration, that future administration would have the option to enforce retroactively everything that happened for 3 years before they came into office. And so that's a really important piece. And then finally, what Morgan had mentioned, the final bullet here, there's around 20 US states which shelved similar regulation when the AIM Act was passed. And states will likely renew efforts to pass these bills if the AIM Act is not being enforced. So I think the bottom line here is that, yes, we all need to worry about AIM Act compliance under Trump. Even if Trump changes course and chooses not to enforce this regulation and goes against what he signed previously, companies do not have the option to take a break from compliance. It's just too risky. It can come back to bite them in the future, and that's a risk that investors and shareholders very likely are not going to be comfortable taking. And I'm sure there'll be questions about that, and I look forward to talking through that during Q&A. So the next question here is, I have so many different priorities, and I'm constantly in a reactive mode, trying to put out fires all the time. How can I convince my leadership to make leak reduction a priority in 2025? And so what we found to be the most effective is to build a business case that's too compelling to ignore. And of course, reach out if you'd like to discuss your specific situation. We've already helped many of the top 40 US grocery chains do this already. So just a couple elements of a typical business case that we see. And of course, depending on your CFO, depending on who's approving this within your leadership team or in your C-suite, different things resonate for different folks because different people have different priorities or different biases. So a couple elements that we've seen across the board work quite well in many cases. The first is avoiding required quarterly manual leak checks. So these are quarterly manual leak checks are required for any appliances that are labeled as chronically leaking. And according to TrackRef, about 25% of all the appliances that they service, we're talking tens of thousands of appliances, are chronically leaking as of 2024. So this data is a couple months old, but our sense is that hasn't changed significantly. And so what that means is that right now, if the AIM Act went into effect today, December 10th, rather than going into effect on January 1st, 2026, like it is when enforcement begins, immediately anyone who's operating these appliances will need to implement manual leak checks, and that's a really expensive undertaking, and it's also somewhat risky because if you miss that leak check window by 1 day, you are violating the AIM Act. And at that point, that carries a fine of up to $57,000 and potentially jail time by missing the inspection by 1 day, even if that technician calls in sick or has another major problem they need to deal with. If you miss that window by 1 day, you're on the hook. And so one thing I had the opportunity to connect with Keely. I'm sure a lot of folks know Keely. She's obviously NASRC affiliated. One of the things that she said really resonated with me, which was even if you never catch a single leak, it's still cheaper to buy full system ALD or automatic leak detection than performing required manual leak inspections. And a really key piece here, and I think a really common misconception in the industry is that, hey, I already have this multi-channel refrigerant sensor or sniffer. However, these sensor-based systems do not excuse you from inspections. By definition, they don't cover underground piping, overhead piping, or rooftop condensers. And manual leak inspections are the easiest thing for the EPA to nail you on. So that really resonated. And if Keely's on the line, thank you for sharing that perspective and changing my thinking there, Keely. The second part of the business models that often are very compelling and can help to build a compelling business case is avoiding emergency repairs and replacement gas expenses. So again, just zooming out and looking at annual leak rates and cost per pound of gas, the average US grocery store is spending $31,000 a year on replacement refrigerant gas. So that's assuming these numbers, 875 pounds of leakage per year, $35 a pound for replacement gas. And of course, everyone's numbers are going to be slightly different than this, but this is kind of order of magnitude. And then addressing a single leak can cost $15,000 or more when you take into account the gas, the technician time, the follow-up visits, and and then replacement parts, et cetera. And that's ignoring lost sales and spoilage that come from other impacts to the business that are less visible. A third piece here, which is tougher to quantify, but is still a really important part of the overall maybe soft benefits of a business case for reducing leak reduction or for reducing leak rates, is avoiding these lost sales and alienating shoppers during cooling outages. And so, as we talked about a little bit earlier, a single day of lost sales can push the store into the red for multiple months if it's a really significant leak. And that's before you take into account basically the fact that you're going to be alienating a lot of shoppers who may not come back during their next shop if they're annoyed that 1 to 3 items from their list are unavailable because of a cooling outage. And then in many cases, avoiding compliance risk, so the final bullet point here, is kind of the primary reason why a certain subset of grocers really care about reducing leak rates. They say, look, I have to address this compliance risk. It's too big to ignore. I cannot justify this. I will lose my job if I end up in a situation where my business is exposed to a lot of compliance risk. And so step one for us is we got to check that compliance box. Everything else on top of that is gravy. And so in a lot of cases, that's how these business cases are written, because that's how leadership stakeholders are thinking about these things. And so that's not a bad situation. That's not a bad starting point, because that opens the door and creates the opportunity to generate all these other business benefits. This is a massive opportunity, folks. We have this enforcement of these various compliance of these various regulations at the state and local level, which are forcing leadership teams to focus on this issue. And that is a massive opportunity for us, all the folks in this room, to achieve some significant progress from a cost, business continuity, sustainability standpoint. As a result of that, it all goes together. So enforcement begins on January 1st, 2026 of the AIM Act. Violations can be triggered on the first day. You do not want to be that person in the industry who is already racking up, $1 million in fines on January 2nd of 2026. Nobody wants to be that guy. So that's how we can build a business case. And of course, if you want to chat more about it, feel free to reach out anytime. We think about this a lot. And so the last piece here is, what are the available options here to reduce leak rates across the portfolio of existing facilities? And so we'll talk about the commonly used options, and then we'll talk about the ones that are highlighted by EPA. So the first and most common, arguably, is using case temperature alarms. Basically, you wait until some of the display cases that are the weakest or the furthest away from the central rack start experiencing they're starved of a liquid column of refrigerant. And what that manifests as is a case temperature alarm. So suddenly your furthest away case is too warm, and you're getting these alarms. And so this essentially guarantees that you're not going to catch these leaks until your receiver is totally empty or very close to it, and you've already lost an enormous amount of gas. And then you're at the point where if you delay by a couple of hours or a couple of days, you're going to experience a significant outage in your facility. The second really commonly method used today is these quarterly manual leak checks, where you have technicians walking the store holding a handheld sniffer or handheld gas sensor. And so maybe it is a little bit unfair to say these are ineffective. These are effective. If the technician is doing a good job and they're being really diligent, they can detect leaks, absolutely. But the problem is that if this is happening once every 90 days, what about leaks that are occurring on the other 89 days? If you have a leak that occurs the day after an inspection, it can fester for months. So that's why I think we use the word ineffective here, but I might revise that if we did this again. These are really expensive. So technicians are expensive. Technician time is scarce. A good technician is a very scarce and prized resource at this point in our industry, as we all know. And this also requires skilled and motivated technicians. So in a lot of cases, we'll end up with technicians who are dealing with so many emergencies that they are just completely exhausted, and going and doing a leak check and walking around a facility that doesn't really have an emergency seems like a lower priority. It's something to just spend a little bit less time and energy and motivation on than, fixing this compressor that's out or whatever else might happen in their day that day. So it kind of falls to the bottom of the priority list. And then these Band-Aid fixes become really common as well for quarterly manual leak checks, where we've heard time and time again examples where a leak is found by the sniffers. The technicians don't really know where the leak is coming from, and so they tighten up a Schrader core that might have a tiny leak, and they call it a day, and they mark the leak as being detected and resolved. And in many cases that's not the case. It has not been resolved, the root cause of it. There's these single point gas detectors. So in many cases, these are, it's a box, you stick it on the wall, in many cases in the machine room or in the walk-in coolers. And so these are often for life safety or for compliance purposes in, for example, California. And so these are somewhat expensive because you do need to show up at each facility. You need to put together a whole project management program to deploy these, get them installed in the right place, and then ultimately have them managed and maintained and calibrated pretty frequently. But the significant drawback here is that while these are great for life safety and making sure that folks are not suffocating because of very large leaks, they're only effective in enclosed areas, and they can only detect really medium or large leaks that are close to the sensor. So these are a really important part of overall compliance and safety and even leak reduction, but they're definitely not solving the majority of the leak problem. If your primary goal is leak reduction, this is not the answer by itself. And then finally, another really common method is looking at receiver level sensor threshold alarms. So commonly we'll see retailers who fill their receivers up to, let's say, 20%, and then they have the Hansen probes, or the analog receiver level sensors, which are providing a percentage receiver level data stream on a live or semi-live basis. And then there's an alarm setup. So as soon as that receiver level gets to 10% or 5%, they receive an alarm. The problem with this is that the data is really noisy and it's difficult to interpret, and there's a lot of false positives. And so we've seen time and time again, the rule, not the exception, is that this data is ignored because there's just so much noise in it, and there's so many alarms coming out of it that folks begin to ignore it, or they don't trust it, or there's even if they wanted to, they couldn't possibly respond to all these different alarms. So, and I think the key drawback here is that beyond that, our estimate is that there's over half of facilities in the United States that do not have these analog receiver level sensor probes. And so installing those on a retrofit basis is not really feasible in a lot of ways, because it is, cutting into a pressure vessel, and then you got to get it ASME recertified. It's just a nightmare. You got to take down the whole store while you're doing that retrofit in many cases. So these are a lot of the more commonly used methods that have been used in the past. Now let's talk about what EPA is putting forth in terms of options that are more compliant in the AIM Act. So they broke it into two categories. There's direct ALD systems. ALD means automatic leak detection. And these are using sensors to monitor the concentration of refrigerants in the air. And there's 8 of these manufacturers listed by the EPA. And in many cases, these manufacturers are using what they call multi-channel leak detectors, which is like a single gas sensor, and then miles of tubing, little tiny capillary tubes, which are kind of networked throughout the facility. And then there's 16 to 64 channels within a facility, and the central sensor is taking little gas samples from each one of those zones on a periodic basis. And so a lot of advantages to this. There's fast leak detection. It can pinpoint the location. It can provide the safety compliance element as well. But there's some drawbacks as well. One is that this does not actually cover the entire refrigeration system because, again, it doesn't cover rooftop piping. It doesn't cover underground piping or in the concrete piping. It doesn't cover any facility, any of the systems that are on the roof, like condensers, et cetera. And then if essentially you can't possibly have enough of these points, because when you have a mile or more of piping within a facility, and these particular sensing points can only detect leaks that are very close to the sensor point, you would just need an enormous number of points to really adequately cover even just the inside elements or reachable elements of that refrigeration system. So the other category that EPA outlines as compliant are these indirect ALD systems. And so essentially the EPA defines that as using predictive analytics to monitor the real-time operating conditions of refrigeration. And so there's 4 of these indirect ALD manufacturers listed by the EPA. And so I got to kind of include this disclaimer here. What's shown on the bottom right here is really about Axiom, not so much about the others, because we're not completely sure about how the others work. We just don't have that insight. But so with Axiom, at least, we're using artificial intelligence that is processing existing sensor data. And essentially, we're looking at over 1,000 of historical site years of data. And we've trained the AI using all that historical data to show this is what a system looks like when it's operating properly and without leaks. And so that's regardless of the location of the facility, the refrigerant type, the configuration, all these other variables. There's just so much variety within that base data set. And then on top of that, anyone here who's familiar with AI knows that first you get to show it what does base case look like, and then you get to show it what do exceptions look like, what do problems look like. And so at this point, we've fed over 50,000 really high quality labeled anomalies or problems into the AI to train it on exactly what does the problem look like. And so the AI is able to learn from that data set and then start to understand, hey, what are the leading indicators for these leaks? So I know that a leak occurred at 3 p.m. on Tuesday, but now that I know that, and I've seen that 200 times, a similar leak, what does the data stream in that facility look like in the 2 weeks or the 4 weeks leading up to that? And so that's how the AI has now gotten really, really good at finding leading indicators for leaks well before you have these cooling outages or really critical system outages. And so, long story short, when we're talking about indirect ALD that's driven by AI from Axiom, at least, these are able to detect leaks anywhere in the system. That's why they're called whole system automatic leak detection solutions. Regardless if it's the condenser on the roof, the overhead piping, in the concrete piping under the floor. It's eliminating the requirement for manual leak inspections. It can detect leaks very, very small, such as as low as a quarter pound a day, even if those leaks are outside. And then this doesn't require any on-site installation. There's no hardware. There's no on-site installation. This can be remotely deployed in over 100 sites a week without ever physically visiting those facilities. So don't mean this to be a sales pitch at all. I just don't have all the right data to speak intelligently about the other ALD solutions that are available today. So those are the various options that are available. We've talked about, obviously, the business case. We've talked about why this is important, the benefits, the regulations, et cetera. We've covered a lot of ground today. And that is the end of the content that I wanted to go through.